You're traveling through another dimension, a dimension not only of sight and of sound, but of mind. A journey into a wondrous land whose boundaries are that of the imagination. There's a signpost up ahead. Your next stop, the narrow mind.
Wonderful show lined up for you today. I've got a guest in studio. I'll be introducing him to you in just a moment. Before I do that, let me remind you that you need to subscribe to our podcast. If you don't know how the podcast thing works, this is real easy. All you have to do, if you have an iTunes player, is click on that pink and blue logo, that little iTunes logo. It's about halfway down on our homepage. And what that'll do is that'll automatically subscribe you to our podcast, so that when you open up your iTunes player, just look in your podcast folder. Our show, the most recent program, will be right there waiting for you, just like the newspaper on your front porch. In addition to that, some of you have asked why you've stopped receiving the email announcements. We used to send out a weekly announcement that would allow our listeners to look and see what the schedule was for that week. The problem is that our mailing list now is up over 3,500, and so what was happening is because of a lot of the addresses were no longer good, it was jamming up our server. And so a jammed up server is not a good thing. And so what we'd like to do then is ask you to subscribe to the blog, the Narrow Mind Aftermath blog. If you subscribe to the blog, we're going to begin posting the weekly show in one of the blog posts. Not the weekly show, the weekly calendar, the weekly schedule. And so that way you can be caught up on what's going on. And if you subscribe to the podcast, then you'll never miss a show to begin with. So that's the preliminary announcements. Now let's get down to business. I have with me in studio a friend of mine. I've known him for several years. His name is Dr. Jim Renihan. He's the professor of Reformed Baptist Studies for the Institute of Reformed Baptist Studies at Westminster Seminary in California. He is an elder of the Trinity Reformed Baptist Church in Escondido, and he got his Ph.D. from Trinity Evangelical School of Divinity, and he specializes in historical theology. Dr. Renahan, welcome to the Narrow Mind.
Thank you, Gene. It's good to be here today.
All right. Now, I asked you to come down to the studio, or maybe I should say up to the studio, so that we could discuss the subject of landmarkism. But before we get into the subject of landmarkism, I know that you teach a class on Baptist distinctives, where you actually go over the not only the Confession of Faith, the 1689 Confession of Faith, but you compare it to what is called the Savoy Declaration of 1658 and also the Westminster Confession of Faith. And one of our listeners has emailed this question. So I thought, because this doesn't really have anything to do with the subject of landmarkism, maybe we could get it out of the way to begin with. And it's an interesting question. He says, this is a question I have for Dr. Renahan. In the Westminster Confession of 1644, Chapter 21 of Religious Worship and the Sabbath Day, we read, prayer and thanksgiving, being one special part of religious worship, is by God required of all men. That it may be accepted, it is to be made in the name of the Son, by the help of the Spirit, according to His will, with understanding, reverence, humility, fervency, faith, love, and perseverance, and, if vocal, in a known tongue. Now, the listener says, the last part, and if vocal in a known tongue, forbids the speaking of unknown tongues. The Savoy Declaration of 1658, written by the Congregationalist, modifies the last phrase to, quote, and when with others in a known tongue. And the London Confession of 1689 follows the language of the Savoy Declaration. My question is this: whether the use of private prayer languages was debated in the 17th century. It seems that while the Presbyterians specifically wrote against the practice, the Congregationalist and the Particular Baptist intentionally made a revision to not teach against the practice. Your comments?
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting question, isn't it? It's at least the third time that someone has given me this question. And usually they're writing to me or asking me the question because they're struggling with the charismatic issue in one way or another. And I always smile because one of the problems that we have when we're reading historical literature is that oftentimes we read our own categories back into that literature and assume that they are addressing the same subjects that are present at the front of our minds. And that's really anachronistic to do that. You have to really get to know the era and the literature and figure it out. So how do you do that? Well, one of the ways that I think it's important to do that with any historical document is to know the literature of the day. And one of the most helpful pieces of literature that I think, especially this question shows how helpful this is. In the 17th century, there were very few expositions that were written of any of these confessions. There were a lot of the shorter catechism or the larger catechism by English and Scottish Puritans. But only one that I know of was written about any of the confessions, and that was by a guy named David Dixon, who was a Scottish Presbyterian, writing in the second half of the 17th century. Okay. And he writes not exactly an exposition, but a question and answer type study of the Westminster Confession of Faith. So when people ask me a question like this, one of the first things that I do is go to look at Dixon and see what he says. What category does he put this issue into? And then that will help me to understand what's going on. So Dixon addresses this question in his book, Truth's Victory Over Error. That's the name of the work that he did on the Westminster Confession. And he, as I said, it's a question and answer format. So he writes this. He says, if prayer be vocal, ought it to be in a known tongue? And then his answer is yes. Now, always in his exposition, then he gives you reasons why. Okay, so here's his reason why. He cites 1 Corinthians 14:14, and then he says, well then, do not the papists err, who maintain that it is not needful that public prayers be in a known tongue, but that it is oftentimes expedient that prayers be performed in a tongue unknown to the common people. Now, as soon as you read that, it puts us in a different category, isn't it? Because it's talking about the Latin Mass.
Right. And
whether or not the Mass ought to be celebrated in the common language. In England, of course, it would be English. In France, it would be French or whatever it is. It's not talking about a private prayer language that would be equivalent to what our charismatic friends say is the gift of tongues, but rather it has to do with whether or not it's appropriate to offer public worship in a language that's unknown to the people, particularly Latin. Now, when the Savoy Declaration and the Second London Confession make the change, when with others in a known tongue, I think that what they're saying is if you're a scholar and you know Hebrew or you know Greek or you know Latin, it's perfectly permissible for you in private to have your devotions in those languages. If you want to sit down with your Hebrew Bible and read through the Hebrew Bible and pray in the Hebrew language, then it's perfectly appropriate for you to do that. But when you get together with God's people, you're sitting in a congregation, and you pray in Hebrew, and they all speak English, you're giving them no edification at all. So in my understanding, it doesn't have anything to do with the charismatic question one way or another. It's all about especially the Latin Mass. Well,
that's a very thorough explanation. I thank you for that because it really puts things in perspective. I agree with you. We do have a tendency to contemporize historical theology and to try to see the issues. This is one of the reasons why when somebody first picks up the 1689 Confession and they read that the Pope is the Antichrist, it boggles their mind. How could the Pope be the Antichrist? A lot of times they're asking that question because their ideas about the Antichrist have been formulated by guys like Tim LaHaye or Hal Lindsey. But if you understood what the Pope was doing in those days or what the Roman Catholic Church was doing, then you might understand why they took such a vehement position against the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, if you had some guy claiming to be a religious leader that was imprisoning and even killing some of your brethren, you might be inclined to think he's Antichrist also, especially if he's naming the name of Christ.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I asked you to come on so that we can mainly talk about the subject of landmarkism. Now, landmarkism is really something that I am unfamiliar with altogether. Growing up in Southern California, not becoming a Christian until I was in my mid-20s, I haven't really been exposed to landmarkism. One of our listeners, who goes by the screen name Heavy Metal Calvinist, writes this. He says, Landmarkism almost destroyed my church. I will make a copy of the show for all the church members. Landmarkism really confused them. They think that Calvinism and Landmarkism are the same thing. I hope that Landmarkism is thoroughly explained historically in context and debunked. I pray Baptists get off the, quote, trail of blood and get back on the narrow way. I pray that it is shown to be truly cultic because it denies the universal church. Thanks, brother. I appreciate you listening and acting on the suggestion. This is actually a guy by the name of Tom Barnes, and he's the lay pastor of Creekside Baptist Church in Waco, Kentucky. So he has a very particular idea and conclusion about landmarkism. I'm wondering, first of all, why don't we begin by explaining what is landmarkism?
Well, hi, Tom. Landmarkism really developed in the south of the United States in the 19th century, although I think that it has roots that go all the way back to problems that stemmed out of the Reformation. One of the charges that the Romanists made against the Reformers, very famous question that they asked was, where was your church before Luther? And the question of the validity of an individual church, and especially of an individual's ministry, the ordination and the right to perform the ordinances or sacraments of the church, is a very pressing issue. And even as far back as the Reformation, when the Romanists were pressing this question against the Reformers, Christians have had to wrestle with this question, this issue. Is my church legitimate? Do I have a right to call myself a church or to call our group a church and to administer by the appointment of Christ himself the ordinances or sacraments of the church? And there have been a wide variety of approaches to try to answer that question. In the 19th century, there were a whole host of movements, both in England and in the United States, that were in one way or another addressing that question. In England, you had what's called the Tractarian movement, or sometimes the Oxford movement, which was a group of scholars centered on Oxford University who argued that the Church of England should not be a Reformation church. The Reformation was a mistake. It would be better to go back to the time prior to the Reformation. Their great leader, John Henry Newman, ultimately became a Roman Catholic and a cardinal in the Catholic Church. Some of the others did not make the step back into Rome, but they had a very high church view of Anglicanism and were calling for the Anglican Church to return to its pre-Reformation roots. And that was a very, very strong and powerful movement in England. In the United States, in the 19th century, you had Alexander Campbell and the Campbellites, who also were wrestling with the same issue, and they developed what's called Restorationism, where they basically rejected the churches that existed and believed that they were restoring the purity of the church. And then among the Baptists in the South, you had a movement that came to be known as Landmarkism, which was really an attempt to legitimize their own churches and to argue that there was a genuine succession that could be traced historically back to the first century, the apostles, oftentimes to either the Lord Jesus and his disciples or to John the Baptist. So it was an attempt on the part of Baptists to provide themselves with a history that basically ignored the Roman Catholic Church. They argued that the church was so deep and so profound in apostasy that one ought not to think in terms of a succession that comes through Rome. And they tried to seek out ways by which they could legitimize their church, their ministry, sidestepping the Roman Catholic Church, going outside of the Roman Catholic Church, looking to other marginal groups, let us say, down through the centuries in a variety of places, and arguing that in those groups there was a genuine succession of baptism of the church, of the Christian ministry, and all the rest.
You know, as you're speaking here, I remember a woman coming to visit our church one Sunday morning, and after the service, she handed me a tract that said that Baptists are not Protestants. and I'm wondering if I didn't read it because I thought this is just silly. But I'm wondering if this was the same type of mindset. She was maybe trying to sidestep the Roman Catholic Church altogether, making the argument that Baptists were in existence prior to the Reformation.
Yes, exactly. I once had a very hot email from a person who will go unnamed right now, basically saying the same thing. Why would you even want to call yourself a Reformed Baptist? The Reformers and the Puritans killed my forefathers, the Baptists, and you want to identify with them. They come out of the whore of Rome. Why do you want to be part of the whore of Rome? Blah, blah, blah. Of course, in the 17th century, the Baptists weren't afraid to call themselves Protestants. It's sort of makes me smile sometimes to see these things. You know?
Right.
Yeah.
So where did the name come from? Do you have any idea where the name Landmark came from?
Yeah, it comes from, is it the prophet Jeremiah who speaks about the old landmark being restored, not to move the landmark.
Okay.
And a book was written in the 19th century. There was a triumvirate of leaders, J.R. Graves, James Madison Pendleton, and A.C. Dayton. And Graves published a book entitled An Old Landmark Reset. And that's how the name came to the Baptist version of this. There are other versions of it as well. See, the Baptists aren't the only ones who have a view of successionism. There was a book published by a Brethren scholar who argued that there is a chain-link succession back for Brethrenism. Of course, in Rome, you have apostolic succession. It's the same thing. It's the same thing, just with the Roman Church being the vehicle. And in some groups that I call high Presbyterians, you have the same kind of view as well. And interestingly, last week, even before we talked about coming on here for the program, I was reading an anonymous tract from the 1640s, in which a Pedo-Baptist separatist was making this argument for his church, to legitimize his church, and he wasn't a Baptist. So there are many different varieties that basically do the same thing.
Okay, what are some of the distinctives of Landmark? Obviously, there would be some things that we would have in common, and then there would be maybe some things that are problematic. Let's begin with the things that we would have in common.
Okay. I think what I would want to say, Gene, is that early 21st century or late 20th century Landmarkism is probably a little bit more caustic and abrasive than some of the 19th century Landmarkism would have been. And that's often the way that it happens. Disciples of a leader will press things beyond where the leader went. Now, there are bad things about the triumvirate as well. Maybe we'll talk about them. What do we have in common? I think it was Leon Macbeth in his book, The Baptist Heritage, who does a good job on Landmarkism. He said that the landmark movement in the 19th century, his phrase was, it put iron in the Baptist blood. And I love that phrase. I think it's really right. It explains why the Baptists in the South, to a large degree, had such a powerful self-identity, a self-consciousness of who they were. And I think to a large degree it does help to explain something of the growth of the Southern Baptists in the South, because it was an articulate defense of a position. Now, some of the things that they said I think are very helpful. James Pendleton's Church Manual, for example, I think is a very useful book on ecclesiology, a very practical book on how churches can function. I would love to see it reprinted. Every once in a while I see a copy on eBay, and if it's selling cheaply, I might put a bid in on it and try to get a cheap copy. I already have one or two, so just looking for them to give away. I think Pendleton's book is really useful and very helpful on as a manual on the church. And there were other things that they said. They were certainly Orthodox men. They preached the gospel. There's no doubt about that. Sadly, some of their disciples have fallen into the pit of sort of making this the cause célèbre, the great thing that they get taken up with, and they lose the gospel in it. Maybe this is important, maybe it isn't, but it's not about Christ, and it's not about the gospel itself, and so it doesn't deserve the place that often it's given by its disciples. So, I think that there are some good things. It had some benefits. It did some bad things. I would argue that the decline of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in the 20th century is a direct cause, or was directly caused by Landmarkism. There was a controversy. The president of Southern Seminary in the 1890s was a man named William Whitsitt. And Whitsitt wrote a book called A Question in Baptist History. It'll cost you $100 to buy a copy of his book now. I have a copy that I didn't pay $100 for, but they're rare and hard to find. But Whitsitt basically argued, rightly, let me say that rightly, he argued, that baptism by immersion was recovered by the English Baptists in the 1640s. But the landmarkers were incensed by this. Now remember, Whitsitt was president of the Southern Baptist Seminary. They were incensed. They forced Whitsitt out of his office. Now Whitsitt, in every other way, was a theological conservative. Well, they forced him out of office because they didn't like his view of Baptist history. He was replaced by Edgar Young Mullins, and Mullins really opened the door for liberalism that came into the Southern Seminary. And it's really only until the 1990s that Southern Seminary has been restored. We owe a great debt to Dr. Moeller and all that he has done now. Mm-hmm. But really, for almost 100 years, Southern Seminary wandered in a theological wilderness, and it was because the landmarkers were able politically in the convention to maneuver Whitsitt out of office. Mullins came in. When Mullins was asked the question, what is your view of Baptist history, he said, I leave that to the historians. He sidestepped the question, but he opened the door for liberalism. And I think that E.Y. Mullins is to blame for a lot of the problems that developed in the Southern Baptist Convention in the 20th century. So that's one of the bad results of it.
Okay, let's talk about some of their distinctives concerning their view of church polity. Would they be first of all, would they be confessional?
Would they be confessional? I don't know. In my reading of Graves, Pendleton, and Dayton, the emphasis is not so much on a system of theology as expressed in a confession of faith, but more on ecclesiological identity. So I don't even know if they would have asked that question. Okay,
would they, when it comes to leadership in the church, would they hold to a plurality of elders?
Generally speaking, no. They would have had a pastor and deacons.
I'm wondering maybe if this is also the influence on the Southern Baptist polity.
Well, you have to remember that the Northern Baptists had the same kind of polity, pastor and deacon type thing. The whole office of elder or the idea of a plurality of elders was to a large degree lost at the end of the 19th century across the board among most Baptists. Not all, but most. So I don't know. I don't think that that's a characteristic of the landmark movement so much as it was a problem that faced Baptists in general.
Okay, and theologically, would they be dispensational? I mean, obviously they began before dispensationalism came along, but I'm just wondering, as we see them now, where would they be?
As we see them now, yes, probably most of them today that I've been familiar with are dispensationalists. Graves wrote a book on the 7 dispensations, and I have a copy of it, but I haven't read it. So I don't think that he used the word dispensation in the same way that Schofield or Ryrie or Darby would have done so, but I haven't read the book, so I can't say.
Graves, when did he live? When did he?
19th century.
Okay.
Yeah. The great triumvirate, J.R. Graves, John Madison Pendleton, James Madison Pendleton, and A.C. Dayton were in the second half of the 19th century. They were basically in the South, although Pendleton was a pastor in Tennessee, and he was forced to leave Tennessee because he was a Union sympathizer. And so he ended up in Upland, Pennsylvania. Dayton was a dentist, and Graves was the editor of the Tennessee Baptist newspaper.
Okay. When it comes to this guy actually writes a pretty strong email against Landmarkism. What do you think is he basically is asking us to identify Landmarkism as a cult? Why would he do that? Do you have any idea?
Well, not being from the South, having visited the South many times, but not being from the South, and I'm from New England and now live in California, I've not run into personally that kind of exclusivity. I've read about it and seen some of it on the internet. And I think that what he is identifying, and I'm reading in here a little bit, is that people who grab hold of causes like this, and there are others that we could mention, probably get in trouble by saying King James only, but that's another cause. That I
you
think
won't get in trouble with me.
No, I know that, brother. Yeah, you and I we've known each other for 8 years. I was thinking about
Wow.
it. You know, that's since I moved out here.
Yeah.
Yeah. People get caught up in these causes, and they dominate their thinking, they dominate their preaching and their presentation, and if you don't jump on board with their cause, then you are pronounced to be a heretic. And I suspect that that's what this brother ran into, is someone who took it up, wanted to press it far beyond anything that it rightly deserved, and that's why perhaps in some places it does become cultish, because it pushes out our preaching of Christ and the gospel and replaces it with, you have to agree with me on my view of chain link successionism.
Now, he also mentions here, I pray that it is shown to be truly cultic because it denies the universal church. Let's talk about that when we come back from the break. We'll also be taking your calls at 1-800-466-1873. Our guest and our friend, Dr. Jim Renahan. Now, if I can digress for just a moment before we get back to the serious subject here of landmarkism. I happened to be thinking about this during the break. As I mentioned, you may recall that on our Covenant Theology Thursdays, we were getting calls a few weeks in a row from a guy by the name of Bradford. Remember, he's the guy that went to a Lutheran seminary, unnamed, in Southern California for a period of 6 years, and is still working on getting his degree. He called, and he called up and told us that he had become a Paedo-Baptist. A Paedo-Baptist. Now, if you didn't hear that program, then let me just give you a little bit of background information. When he came out here and first started going to seminary, he started attending Dr. Renihan's church. Dr. Renihan has a lovely young daughter by the name of Beth, right? And she just happened to catch the eye of young Bradford Myers. Now, at that point, I think I would have given Bradford Myers the left foot of fellowship and kicked him right out of the church. But he decided that he wanted to pursue a relationship with Dr. Renahan's daughter. And he did so. They got married. They have a family. But now he's become a Paedo-Baptist. Now, when I heard that, I was feeling Dr. Renahan's pain. Now, not only has his daughter been taken by Bradford Myers, but she's now the wife of a man who is a Paedo-Baptist, which means the grandchildren are baptized. And it boggled my mind. When I heard this, Jim, I wanted to do something to Bradford. I was thinking, should I let the air out of his tires? Should I vandalize his motorcycle? What should I do? There was only one word that came to mind.
Idiot!
So, Bradford, even though you're in Ohio now,
Oklahoma.
no, every time he calls up, it's an inside joke.
Okay.
I tell him, he says, my wife says, this is Bradford's calling from Oklahoma. And I say, let's go out to Bradford from Ohio. It drives him absolutely crazy. It's Oklahoma, man. The Sooners, or whatever they are. Is it the Cornhuskers? I don't know what they are. I don't follow that. I don't follow college football at all. All right, I had to get that off my chest, and all I got to say is, I hope that God keeps me humble and gracious. Should my daughter ever marry a Paedo-Baptist, I hope that I can demonstrate the same fruit of the Spirit that Dr. Renahan has. All right, getting back to the subject now. He mentions here at the end of this email, this is our listener, Tom Barnes, that Landmarkism denies the universal church. Now, based on your experience, your knowledge of Landmarkism, is it true, or is it safe to say that Landmarkism denies the universal church?
I think many of the landmarkers do deny the universal church. Yes, certainly.
Now, let me just define for our listening audience, because we have a wide variety. We have pastors, seminary students, lay people. We have mothers listening.
Hi, Mom.
We do. In fact, we have members of our church that take the kids to school and then they sit down in front of their computer and drink their coffee. And when we talk about the universal church, it's careful to note that when we talk about the church can be spoken of in two different ways, from two different perspectives. It can be spoken of as a local church, or what might be called the visible church, the church that congregates on the corner of Main Street on Sunday morning, where you have a group of people that come together. But the confessions, the Reformed confessions, also recognize that the church can be spoken of in universal terms, or from the standpoint of the invisible church. That is, the church that consists of the elect for all times, or at least in the immediate context, the church that is made up of true believers that are worshiping at different geographical locations all around the world. And so he's talking about a denial of this universal church. Would they say that if you're not part of the Landmark movement, then you are not part of the church?
Well, that's an interesting question, because Graves was accused, J.R. Graves was accused of holding that very position, you see. And it goes back to the need to have some kind of visible succession. I usually don't use the term landmark. I prefer to use the word succession. Because I think succession better, even though the landmark men would use the word landmark, I think succession better speaks to the historical issue. Can we actually demonstrate in any way that there is that my baptism comes from a man who was properly baptized and ordained in a church where he was properly baptized and ordained, etc., back through every generation, all the way back to the apostles? This need for visible, outward, physical, let us say, unity. Okay, and with the Landmark movement, and it's exactly the same argument that the Roman Catholics use in apostolic succession. Exactly the same. It's exactly the same argument that's used by the men that I call high Presbyterians. It's all the same argument, you see. I don't think that any of these guys ever contemplate the fact that others use the same argument to make a different point.
I wonder if they have the same names in the list and they just change it at a particular point.
Well, that could be, although with both the Romanists and the high Presbyterians, they're willing to go through Rome. And with the Successionist Baptists, they're not willing to go through Rome usually. But if you have this view, this chain link view, where there has to be some kind of physical, lineal succession, then those who don't have a baptism or a church in that physical lineal succession are outside of the church. So Graves objected to what they called alien baptism or alien immersion. That is, even an immersion that was done outside of a Baptist church was not a valid baptism. And they also rejected what they called pulpit affiliation, meaning they wouldn't recognize the ordination of any man who was not properly ordained in a properly constituted Baptist church. So you could never have Charles Hodge come and preach in your pulpit. Spurgeon was wrong to have some of the great Presbyterians who came to the Metropolitan Tabernacle preach in his pulpit. You just couldn't do that. They were not ministers of the gospel. They couldn't be recognized for the validity of their preaching, never mind their administration of the Lord's Supper or a baptism or anything like that. They couldn't be. And all of that relates to a denial of the universal church. You see, you have to say to some degree, they are not part of the true church. The true church is found in our succession. And if you're outside of our succession, you're not part of the true church. Now, Graves, some of those who objected to his views accused him of going so far as to saying that these people weren't Christians. And he used language that would seem to imply that. But he always protested and said, no, that's not my point. I'm not saying that they're not believers. I'm just saying that they're outside of the true church. Well, is there any salvation outside of the true church?
No,
see, is the question. No, there isn't. That's right. That old Latin phrase, extra ecclesiam non sit salus, is absolutely true. There is no salvation outside of the church. And so Graves got in trouble, and he always had a very difficult time in his response to apologetics trying to convince people that he wasn't unchristianizing those that he was unchurching, you know. So yes, there is a very real denial of the universal church, and it directly relates to this successionist view.
Now, do they claim Charles Spurgeon as part of their group, their succession?
I don't know. Probably they is a little bit too broad.
Okay.
I think some would probably respect and appreciate Spurgeon, and others might not.
So there's not a monolithic movement.
No, there isn't a monolithic movement. It's actually very interesting, even to read the literature and see how they put together their line of succession to justify their own churches. And there are a variety of ways that they do it. Some of them go through Wales, and they argue that there's a tradition that in the apostolic age, some of the individuals who are mentioned by Paul at the end of some of his epistles came to England and brought the gospel to England and planted a true Baptist church, and that Baptist church successfully maneuvered its way through all of the ages. It was up on the hill country, the border country between England and Wales, and they argued that there is a succession that comes through Wales. Others try to trace it in other places by looking to some of the marginal, at best, movements that certainly have existed through church history.
Is there anything that you can think of that comes to mind, and I'm sure you've pondered this question, explicitly in Scripture that teaches that we have to have a succession that can be a succession that can be traceable?
No, I don't think so. But they go to a passage like in Matthew 16 where the Lord Jesus says, "I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." And they say, Jesus is talking about a Baptist church. A Baptist church is a true church. Jesus is talking about a Baptist church. Jesus would fail in his words if there were not always a true Baptist church upon the earth. Therefore, there must always have been a true Baptist church. So they go to passages like that, and they reason in that way.
So then the ordinance of baptism defines whether a church is a true church.
Yeah, and that's the strange thing is that let me mention a book that I think is really fabulous in its treatment of this. It's by James McGoldrick, and it's entitled "Baptist Successionism: A Crucial Question in Baptist History." And Dr. McGoldrick sets up, he gives a chapter to each of the different groups that oftentimes successionists appeal to. And he evaluates them. His first chapter, or the preface maybe, the test that he sets up is to say, what would we accept today? What would a Baptist church look like today? What would we all agree are the essentials for a genuine Baptist church? And then as he goes through each of these groups in church history, he asks the question, do they meet the credentials, the criteria that are necessary for us to recognize them as Baptists? And he demonstrates that they don't meet that criteria. Some of them may have practiced a form of believer's baptism. Sometimes it wasn't even the kind that we have. One of the groups, for example, the baptism was at age 30, but it was putting a copy of the Scriptures on your head and reciting the Lord's Prayer. It didn't have anything to do with water.
I haven't heard that one before.
But in the records, it's called baptism. So naively, some of our friends have attached themselves to this and said, see, they had a baptism at age 30, therefore there was a true Baptist church there. Well, Dr. McGoldrick shows that these groups are wanting in terms of the criteria that we would normally use today. If these people came to us today and wanted to join our church, we would say, no way. There's no way that we would allow you in. You're dualists. You have this strange doctrine or that strange doctrine. We can't accept you into our midst.
All right, let me give out our phone number once again. If you have a question or a comment for Dr. Renihan, we have about 15 minutes left in the program. Our number is 1-800-466-1873. That's toll-free, 1-800-466-1873. Let's go out and talk to Matt calling from Ohio. Matt, welcome to The Narrow Mind.
Hi, Gene. Hi, Dr. Renahan.
Hi, Matt.
I used to be a landmarker, and I just left the landmark movement within the last year, almost a year ago. And so I kind of have some insight. I fellowshipped with a lot of landmarkers. I preached for them, and I kind of have some insight to some of the things you guys have been talking about. I might be able to maybe just throw some information out there.
Go ahead. Let's hear what you got.
Okay. Well, you talked about the universal church was one that I caught my attention, and J.R. Graves had the issue of whether or not you can be, whether or not those first people are Christians or not, and of course you mentioned that historically and confessionally that there is no salvation outside of the church, so saved equals church equals saved. But in Landmark movement, that wouldn't be true. They would say that there are three groups of people, and I'm not saying this can be backed up by the scriptures, but they would say that there are three groups of people. There are those that are, of course, the lost, the reprobate, outside completely. But then there would be those who are. Then there'd be the other two groups would be those who are saved, and there would be some of those that are in the church, which would be a Landmark church, and then some of those saved people. In fact, the majority of those saved people would be outside of the church, and then of course within Landmarkism, you would have the Baptist Briders who would say that only the church is going to be raptured, and because the church is only the Landmarkers, only Landmarkers would be raptured, and the rest of the Christians would be left behind. That the non-church Christians, and then that only the Baptists would be in the bride.
So then,
kind of have that aspect of it.
After the Landmark church is gone, then they could go down and join the true church. I think that would kind of have to undermine their.
There wouldn't be a true church left for
succession.
them to join,
That's right.
though. Yeah.
They'd have to leave at least one elder behind, one pastor. Wow, that's kind of interesting. So three groups: the lost, the saved, and the really saved.
Right? Yeah. Basically, that's how they would look at it.
You know what?
And
I was going to say it almost sounds like a distinction I heard that was made by the URC. They said that, well, not when it comes to individuals, but when it comes to churches, they didn't recognize this as a Baptist church, as a true church. And when I asked him about it, he says, "No, we're not saying that you're not a church. You're a sect of the body of Christ." But when it came, I had a lunch with a URC pastor, and he said, "No, we believe that the URC is the true church, and that those, not the only true church, but those within the URC would certainly be part of the true visible church. But there was this kind of hierarchy between churches, sects, and
false church.
And false,
yeah,
right,
that's
false
the
religion.
taxonomy. Yeah.
Okay, and you were going to say something else there, Matt?
Yeah, I was going to say as far as the cult question, I think what makes Landmarkism cultic or very close to cultic is there is that aspect of them being the only true church, and that they only have baptism because as Dr. Renahan has said several times that they believe in strict successionism, and so the authority to baptize can only be found in landmark churches. The authority to establish churches, to ordain folks, these things can only be found in landmark Baptist churches. And they'll do genealogies where if they find that, say, you have a church that was planted by a landmarker, then you get back maybe 3 or 4 generations of churches, and you find suddenly, there's a non-landmarker in there, or somebody who didn't have landmark baptism, then suddenly you just unchurch that whole group, and the entire group has to be rebaptized, and that pastor would have to be reordained, and that church would have to be reconstituted to make it an official landmark or successionist church.
Yeah, to me it's ironic how sectarian it is, and I go back to what I've already said. It is just as sectarian as the Roman Catholic and the High Presbyterian view. All three of them are sectarian. We're the right ones. We're the only ones. If you don't agree with us, if you don't have our baptism, if you don't have our ordination, you're not true. And it's sectarian, is what it is. It divides the Church of Christ.
Now I'm wondering, Matt, did you leave on good terms?
I tried. I came to see a definitely more reformed covenantal theology. Amen. Because you asked too about dispensationalism, and the vast majority, if not all of them, that I knew of were dispensationalists. In fact, at one point when I started leaning post-trib, I was there were people who would no longer allow me to preach or fellowship with me. But when I became covenant theology, I kind of stuck around for a while and was hoping that I could influence some within the movement and kind of bring them out with me. But eventually, when it was discovered what I was doing or what I actually believed, not that I was hiding it, but I was trying to bring it slowly, I guess. I was cut off from the group. I was cut out, and my whole church with me. In fact, our church split over it here in Ohio. Our church basically split over that here in Ohio. So it was not necessarily a friendly movement, although there are still some within the movement that I keep in touch with, but they would also make a distinction between ecclesiastical fellowship and then Christian fellowship. So they could fellowship with me because I'm still a Christian, but they cannot fellowship with me ecclesiastically because I'm not in a true church.
Yeah, it's amazing to me how this mirrors other things that I've encountered. It's incredible.
There's nothing new under the sun.
No.
That's for sure. No. Now, was the main issue that you left over then your transition into covenant theology, or was it the fact that you were post-trib? What was the main issue that caused them to cut you off?
Basically, with the view of the church, because that, as Dr. Renahan pointed out, that becomes their central focus. Everything is built around, the church, and so once you differ from them on that view, then that's really the big thing. I mean, other issues like eschatology and things of that nature, they'll be very important to them, to the landmarker, but there will be some landmarkers who will still be okay with it, who will, you might be on the outside of the fellowship, towards the outside edge of the fellowship, but not completely out. But when it comes to the ecclesiology of it, then that's what really, that's the final straw, the final line. You have to be in or out on that. You're in or out on that. Okay,
based on your experience and what you know about landmarkism firsthand, is it a cult or is it not a cult?
Wow, that's a tough question. I still have friends in the landmark group.
But you want them to come out, right?
I do, absolutely, I do. I would say that.
Now, I'm not asking you if they're not saved.
Right, I understand. It's if it's not a cult, it's as close to a cult as you can be without being a cult. But it would seem to be because they, there are some who will take it to that next step and say that there is no salvation. They would agree with the historic position. There is no salvation outside the church, and since they are the true church, there's no salvation outside of them. And I mean that would definitely be cultist or cultic. Mm-hmm. So those that would hold to that view would definitely be cult. But there are others who would back away from that because they want to. They don't want to. I'm not really sure why they back away from that, but there are some who would back away from that and say, no, there's three groups, and in that situation, they tend to be probably what some landmarkers would call liberal, but they I guess when it comes to their view of baptism and the church and ordination, from that aspect, it would be cultic. I don't know. I'd have to have a good working definition of cult.
Okay, let me just ask you one final question, then we got to go. There will be landmark church members that will listen to this MP3. If you could say one thing to somebody that's in a landmark church, what would it be?
Okay, the landmark position is built on the definition of the word ecclesia. And the word, from their view, the word ecclesia means a called out assembly. And so the word ecclesia is used for church throughout the New Testament. A church can only be a called out assembly. In their view, in their mindset, a universal church cannot assemble. And so so the word ecclesia cannot ever be used to describe a universal church. It can only be used to describe a local church. Except J.L. Dagg addressed that issue saying, well, the landmarker will say that when we're not actually assembled, we're still a church because we can assemble. And so J.L. Dagg says that the term ecclesia can describe a universal church because the universal church will assemble someday, in glory. Or the other view, too, is when you think about the union we have in Christ, at Hebrews 12, we come to Mount Zion, and we're assembled, in union with Christ even then. And that's kind of the view I would take. So I would say that they really need to consider how the Bible uses the word and not how their understanding of the Greek word ecclesia defines the word, but rather the way the Bible would use it.
All right, very good. Your input has been very helpful to us today, Matt. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right,
Matt. Thanks. If I can follow up a little bit, I think a text like 1 Corinthians 12:28 is really key here. And God has appointed, now it's tithemi, and tithemi has a very specific use when God is the one who's doing the appointing. It means placed. God is appointed in the church. Now, if the landmark view is right, that ecclesia can only be used of a local church, God has appointed in the church first apostles, second prophets, third teachers, then miracles and gifts of healing, etc. Well, which local church is an apostle appointed to? Which local church receives only a prophet, you see? Mm-hmm. Now, even in Jerusalem, the Jerusalem church had apostles, but they didn't have Paul, nor was their the sphere of their responsibility limited to that church. You see, Christ has appointed in the church at large,
right. The universal church.
The universal church, thank you, apostles, prophets, teachers, etc. I think that's a problem text right there. Now, there are others, but that's a problem text for that view of ecclesia, besides the fact that you don't define words by etymology.
Right. Now, it's amazing how many times I've actually read that verse and used it for other doctrinal problems, mm-hmm. such as modern-day apostles and things like that, comparing mm-hmm. it with, well, actually I'm thinking of Ephesians. I'm thinking of Ephesians chapter 5, mm-hmm. Where some would use the what they call the fivefold ministry doctrine, mm-hmm. and they would use those passages God has appointed. Yeah. But I've read that verse, even the verse that you just quoted from 1 Corinthians 12, and I've never really seen it from that angle. Mm-hmm. And it's true. You can't just define the church as a local church mm-hmm. given that verse. Mm-hmm. You can't.
No.
There's a universal aspect.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. We've got about 2 minutes left, Dr. Renahan. Is there anything else you'd like to say on this subject before we log off, before we sign off?
The one more book I'd like to suggest that I think would help, and it's a book that I helped to edit a couple of years ago called Baptism in the Early Church, mm-hmm. written by two South African Dutch Reformed scholars, Hendrik Stander and J.P. Lowe. And they show that infant baptism didn't develop in the early church really broadly till the 3rd or 4th century. It's a long, I think a well-argued book. But it relates to this question of successionism in that I think sometimes the successionists give away too much, in that they seem to argue that almost within the generation of the apostles, the church in general lost the doctrine of believers' baptism by immersion, and so they have to send a group to Wales in order to legitimize the church, where Stander and Lowe show that believers' baptism by immersion was the general practice, broadly speaking, of the church to a large degree up till the 3rd, 4th, even 5th century with Gregory Nazianzen. So I think that sometimes the landmarkers give away too much when they come to the early church. And that book, it's available on the ARBCA website, www.reformbaptist.com. It's right at the top. There's a logo. You can order it. It's really a good book. It's probably on Amazon.com as well.
All right. And if there's anybody out there that might be interested in pursuing a degree from Westminster, California, mm-hmm. How could they contact you and get more information about the Institute of Reformed Baptist Studies?
Yes, www.reformedbaptistinstitute.org is our website. And there's an email link there, and there's lots of explanation. Be glad to answer any questions anybody has.
All right. Well, thanks so much for coming up.
Welcome.
And I really enjoy the fellowship and the dialogue. Don't forget to tune in tomorrow, folks, at 9 a.m. for Atheistic Wednesday. There's a group out there on the Internet that has they put out a challenge. They're asking men and women all around the world to make a video blaspheming the Holy Spirit and then upload it to YouTube. So we're going to examine that challenge tomorrow, and then we're going to play a couple of videos for you just so you can see not only are these people confused about their worldview, but they don't even understand what blasphemy of the Holy Spirit is. So we'll be talking about that tomorrow. Maybe if we could explain to these atheists what blasphemy of the Holy Spirit really is, then they would pull down their challenge or at least rephrase it. Well, I think it's kind of late, actually, but we'll be talking about that tomorrow. I don't want to give too much away. All right, you've been listening to The Narrow Mind. My name is Gene Cook. Until next time, may the Lord continue to bless the study of His Word.